Okay. Let's see how many of us can get on here. Well, I just got a message saying that the technical difficulties have been addressed, and so people should be coming on in a minute or so.
Outstanding. Here's Christine.
Okay.
We're all.
Hi. Christine, you're still mute. Oh, there you go.
Yep.
So did Megan get a link then? A speaker
She
link?
was on, she's on the she can log into the general link, and Eddie said he could move her over. So we should be good to go.
Okay.
What is NM?
NM?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind.
Okay, no problem.
I haven't even figured out LOL yet, and because it means several things, I guess. And so I just figure I'm old.
It's laugh out loud, but my kids told me a while back when I said LOL, they said, no, it's just lull.
Lull?
It's like, I can't keep up, so I'm giving up.
Yeah, there's laugh out loud, but somebody told me lots of love, and so,
Lovely. Even better.
Even better, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't even try to keep up with my children. I figure that sooner or later they have to come and speak to me about money. So I'll always kind of have that perfect.
There's always a link there. There's always an opportunity to communicate, right?
I met your son a couple weeks ago, Scott. Right. He was wonderful.
Thank you. He is, even if he wasn't my son, I think he's a pretty special guy. He really enjoyed meeting you, Christine, and was very thoughtful about your conversation.
Oh, good. Yeah, I had a nice time chatting with him. He's obviously the product of people who pay attention to what's happening in the world. So,
yeah, well, too many fundraisers at an early age, I think. So.
Yeah, I dragged my poor kids to fundraisers, neighborhood meetings, community events for about a decade.
Yeah, wow. Goes with the territory.
Yeah, my little one was like that too. It's it's when you do certain kinds of things, there's just no choice sometimes.
Yep. Let's see if we have
Anthony is the question. He was on the earlier call, but I don't see him right this moment.
I'm texting Megan. I don't have Anthony's phone number though.
I don't either.
Yeah. Eddie, if you're on the call, could you maybe try to ping Anthony? He was here but he hasn't come back in again, and so I don't know what the deal is with him. Well, we've severely cut into the time with Megan today, and so she's gonna have to either talk really fast or we might have to schedule a follow-up with her, depending
Yeah.
on what the subjects are.
The other thing is, because I'm her appointee, I mean, I've had multiple conversations with her on this topic, have sat in
Right.
on other meetings that are similar. So if I know what anybody is interested in having change in the charter, it's definitely President Green. So,
Right. Well, she has made her interests in the charter known, and so I think that this is an opportunity for her at least to get some of them on record from the point of view, from the aldermanic point of view, so that they get into our working group report.
Absolutely. I guess while we're waiting for everyone, just for you both to know, I've started to reach out to other charter commissions, talk to Webster Groves. I have an appointment with St. Louis County, talk to Kansas City and Portland. So I'm going to put together some notes and share them with the commissioners. I've been learning some pretty interesting things.
That would be very helpful. Christine, how is Megan going to feel about moving all elections to the August-November slot?
I think she would be supportive of that.
I would think so, but yeah, because at and I am going to reach out on behalf of the commissioners, the other two, and email them and ask them a couple of questions for them to come back with some detail. So,
all right, I see President Green, so I'm going to call Eddie and ask him to move her over.
Well, and I think that the discussion that we had last time with the election officials about the ability to write into the charter some flexibility so that there is an option to not always have in-person elections unless they are legally required to be held that way, would be very add a lot of flexibility to that process.
Great.
Eddie's not answering, but I did text him and ask for Megan to be promoted in the chat.
Okay, I'm back and I'm going to try to do that right now.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sorry. I'm so sorry, everybody.
It's okay.
No problem, Eddie.
We understand technology isn't always our friend. Especially since none of us make our living at it. It's my nemesis half the time.
Same here.
I am part of a venture capital firm, so I guess I kind of make a little bit.
You kind of make a living a little bit, but you're not one of those techies that get in there with the tools and do this stuff.
Christine, am I promoting them to panelists? Is that what you think I'm doing?
That's correct.
And should I promote everybody who?
Just President Green, and then Alderwoman Sanye will be hopping on it too. She'll need to be promoted to panelist as well because she doesn't have a unique login.
Okay, I'm gonna promote Ms. Green right now.
Great, thank you so much.
I wonder if they have to go to school to learn this stuff. Computer classes. Here she comes.
It was so funny. I could hear you all talk about me, but I couldn't say anything.
Your ears burning, right?
I'm here.
Well, thanks for joining us, President Green. As I mentioned to you, this is the working group that's been tasked with several charter articles, including the Board of Aldermen. So the voting members here were just interested in starting to talk to elected officials. So feel free to go over, I guess definitely with specificity, things you would like to see change with the Board of Aldermen, but then also feel free to add anything else you want us to be paying attention to.
Well, number one thing I think is the name, the Board of Aldermen. I think that needs to be changed to City Council or something that is gender neutral and more up to date. I work a lot with other elected officials across the country, and nobody knows what an alderman is. Everybody's a city council member, and it's always like, I'm president of the board, which is our version of city council. So, I think Chicago's the only one that still calling it alderman. So, I would like to see that change and just wording throughout the charter to be made gender neutral. Second thing I would like to see is around budget authority. One of the challenges I think the board has right now is that we can only decrease things from the budget. We can't increase things from the budget. And so I would like to see a system that's more like I think like Congress, and you still have two chambers, right? Like ENA is basically like the Senate, and the Board of Aldermen is basically like the House, and so both would have to ultimately agree on the budget, but by not having the authority to increase budget line items, it makes the budget process for the Board of Aldermen just very like performative at the moment. And along with that, I would like to see some kind of mechanism for that gives the board like leverage over the budget. So, maybe like if a budget isn't passed by July 1st, that it becomes up to the like the previous year's budget or something stays in effect until the New Year's budget is passed, because there's also like no leverage at the moment. So if the board doesn't pass a budget, then whatever initial a budget was passed by ENA goes into effect. So again, it like the board just doesn't have budget authority that traditional legislative branches would have. We don't really have the power of the purse. So I would like to see that change as well. I think the third major change that I think impacts the board a lot is around the city councilor's office. We continue to have, I think, issues. I've served under 3 different mayors now, and I think because the Board of Aldermen doesn't have any control over like appointment authority over the city councilor, even though the city councilor in the charter says that like that position is supposed to represent the Board of Aldermen. In practice, I think we often see that the city councilor acts more along the lines of whatever the mayor wants, because that's who has the power to hire and fire them. So because of that setup, it often ties our hands at the Board of Aldermen. We need legal counsel. We need, counsel that is going to tell us whether, what we're doing or not is like legally defensible, but should just be doing it from like the point of view of like the law, not the politics of, what the mayor wants or whatever. So
Are you
I
recommending that there be a vote then on the city councilor?
So I think there's 2 different possibilities. I think one would be that, the mayor nominates, the Board of Aldermen confirms, and that the, city councilor could be removed by like a 2/3 vote or something from the Board of Aldermen. I think that's one way. Another way would be to create kind of separate law departments, so that the Board of Aldermen has a law department and the executive branch has a law department that is supposed to be kind of this insulated, non-political entity. I forget what they call it at the state level, but they basically have like a legislative research office that for all intents and purposes is supposed to be apolitical and just kind of draft things based upon the law, based upon what like elected officials are asking to be, drafted and things like that. So I don't know that I have a preference for either one of those. I think there's kind of pros and cons for each. But I do know, but the underlying problem I think is that if the board doesn't have the legal support that we need, it makes it really difficult to be able to do our jobs. And so I think those are kind of my big three.
Well, Megan,
Yeah.
let me raise the elephant in the room, or whatever we want to call it at this point. My understanding is that the structure of government in the city of St. Louis is really very different than it is around the country right now. That a lot of governments have changed from a model that may have actually started the way ours did a long time ago. And the question, of course, is the E&A. And also the fact that not only does the Board of Aldermen not have budgetary authority, but they don't have the opportunity to be able to elect their leader the way, for instance, the House of Representatives would be able to. So you've been on both sides. You've been on both sides. You've been in the Board of Aldermen, and now you're on the E&A. And the question is not the personalities that are associated with all of this now, but the question of government, good government structure, and what, from your point of view, are the positives and negatives that not only affect the ability of government to be able to operate now, but going into the future. I mean, I hear from whoever it is out there, developers and everybody, about the labyrinth that they have to go through to be able to get permission right now to be able to do things in the city of St. Louis. What, you've worked on both sides. Give us your take on this issue.
I mean, I think the way that I look at it right now, and you are absolutely correct. We have a very odd structure of government. I sort of look at E&A as like the Senate, and the Board of Aldermen is the House. I think there are some necessary checks and balances there, right? Like I think having kind of the checks and balances on budgetary authority is good, as long as both branches have budgetary authority, right? But I also think it makes it very confusing. Actually, I'm going to add one more thing on what I just said. I think that the benefit of E&A is contracting. I think if every contract had to be approved through the Board of Aldermen, the way we approve them through E&A, that would be overly cumbersome. And so if I'm not necessarily opposed to eliminating E&A and moving to a more like modern form of government, but if we do that, I think we got to figure out what are the other ways that we can handle contracting and some of these real estate decisions and the things that E&A are doing that I also don't necessarily think should just go through a legislative process, because we don't want every contract to be mired in kind of political battles. But I don't know enough about other cities to kind of know how they handle that process.
Yeah. Well, what I've heard said is that what we have results in a quote unquote weak mayoral system, and the buck stops where, and that is a dilemma that comes through the kind of, the checks and balances are great, but the other side of it is who's responsible. So, and where does the buck stop? So I just want to ask this question. I don't know if I have a strong opinion one way or another, but it's a question that I certainly hear, and I'm sure you guys hear in the community over and over again. And I think we would be remiss as a charter commission if we didn't look at this question closely, particularly when there are, quite frankly, so many complaints out there by entities about how slow moving government is in the city of St. Louis. In fact, having to do with contracts. So, this is just, I need to get this out now so that we get it into the, into the conversation, because I think if we end up at the end of this year, not having discussed this issue, and make our recommendations, there are going to be people out there just going, wait a minute, they didn't even address this issue. So
I think that it would make more sense to actually have budgetary sign off under the executive branch. So checks issued and things like that from the executive branch rather than the comptroller's office. And I think the role of the comptroller should be more like a public advocate, like we see in New York City, that is in charge of like auditing and like kind of ensuring those good governance mechanisms. Because right now there's also kind of a conflict in our charter, because you have a comptroller that is supposed to sign the checks, right? Like make the payments, but is also in charge of being the auditor. And
yeah, that's not clean.
Typically, right. If you work in an actual like accounting firm or something, there is a wall between the people who are doing the financial statements and the people who are auditing them. And so I think it would make more sense to move some of those budgetary functions over to the executive branch and have a comptroller be more of a public advocate, watchdog position that's doing that continual auditing that, we several years ago created like an ethics commission that has never had like board members appointed to it or anything like that. But I could see that being like a mechanism too. So if there are like ethics complaints, that it goes over to that office, and they're the ones that are charged with, investigating and kind of enforcing those types of rules, because it's not happening at the moment.
Comptroller the same way as the city councilor. The mayor appoints, the board of aldermen approves by vote. Is that what you would advocate?
I mean, I think it could be done that way. It could also be an elected position. New York City, their public advocate is elected. And I mean, I would encourage you to look into that position. I think it's pretty cool what they've done. And so then the voters know, like, we're electing this person as our good government watchdog, right? We know that their job is to audit city government, to, cross all the T's, dot all the I's. And I think that's a better role for that.
But that
position
is not, that's not the controller, though. That's a public advocate, and it might well be what you're describing. The controller the finance office should actually be a part, like a department of government, versus a separate entity the way it is now.
Yes.
So it could be audited too.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So
it's the way it's set up now, it doesn't audit itself.
Correct. So you would move all of the finance pieces over to the executive branch, and, kind of change the job duties or responsibilities of the comptroller, and perhaps even the name, to make it a position that's more of a government watchdog position.
So Megan, the one thing going back to your federal model though, and I'm sorry, President Green, the federal model would be that the board, the current Board of Alders represents the Congress. The mayor is clearly the president, but you would also have a Senate there that would
Yeah.
ratify a budget and approve and meet in committee. Do you see that function being necessary there?
Not necessarily. We had a bicameral, city council at one point back in like the early 1900s. I think, when we reduced down to 14 wards, I wish that the proposal that had been on the ballot would have created at-large seats and districted seats. Because I think, I think 14 is much better than 28, but I also think that the president is the only position that is really charged at taking a citywide view to policymaking at the moment. And I think that sometimes what holds us back is that we only look at policy through the lens of the like small communities that we represent and not the overall, like, how does this help or hurt the entire city?
I think you're absolutely right about that. And
Really
one of the
quickly,
things, oh, go
Anna,
ahead.
I'm really sorry. I just want to be respectful of Alderwoman Sonier's time. I know we were cut short with President Green, but I want to make sure that we're also including. So if we could just wrap up with President Green, and I can always schedule time for her to come back with us.
Great.
We would benefit from that
Yeah.
if she could make the time.
So
I'm
we could
happy
get-
to.
So we could get the other 15 minutes.
I don't
right?
know what the structure was too of it, if it has to be separate conversations.
We scheduled President Green first, then you, and then we're going to be doing a group discussion next because the voting members of the commission were interested in kind of determining which model might work best. So
Okay.
I'll leave that up to them. We can ask President Green to stay if she has the time. I only scheduled her till 2. And Alderwoman Sonier, we had you from 2 to 2:30.
I mean, if you want me to stay, I can stay as long as you don't mind me eating some of my pizza while we're.
Yeah, I don't mind it at all. I think it might be helpful to have both perspectives at the same time. Might be a useful
I
joint.
think that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we would repeat many of the questions for you anyway. And so hearing the two of you together, at least you guys would know what each other had said and could add to it at that point. Going back then to my question to President Green.
Can I ask you questions to catch up? Because I heard some stuff, but I didn't miss.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you guys, I came in and you were talking about conflicts. It looks like you're kind of talking about conflicts in the city charter and saying like the conflict between the comptroller and the duties and maybe making that another thing. Did you guys discuss any other conflicts in the city charter?
We hadn't, I think, gotten that far with the conflicts in the city charter, but we had started to talk about the structure of the ENA and the Board of Aldermen and how the Board of Aldermen lack budgetary authority. And the question that I just was going to ask President Green then to follow up on the conflicts issue was that while we had talked about the potential conflict with regards to the controller's office and how it couldn't audit itself, it would seem to me that if we maintained a bicameral structure right now, at least with the president of the Board of Aldermen elected the way they are right now, that we end up with a conflict there also, which is that we have the quote unquote head of the alderman at that point on the ENA. How do they then support one or the other? That to me also is a potential conflict. And I wanted to hear what she had to say about that and what you would have to say about that.
And if it's helpful, Alderwoman Sonier, this working group is tasked with a few areas in the charter. One of the articles is the Board of Aldermen. So once we move past this question, I think it would be helpful. One of the things we were going to ask you is, like, with specificity, what you would like to see changed at the board itself. And then if there's anything else in the charter you'd like to make sure that we are paying attention to and try to address.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, I can let Megan answer, and then I already have a list prepared of what I'd like to
Anthony,
say, so I'm ready.
Nobody, Anthony, we can't hear you.
I think
Anthony.
you need to turn your volume up, Anthony. Oh, he's leaving.
Okay.
Okay.
I could see him talk, his lips moving,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
So
um,
Alderman Saunier, or Alderwoman Saunier, it would be helpful if you just gave us your list of what you would like to see. That would be informative.
Yeah.
Okay, I've condensed it for the sake of time and just kind of picked some main things that I observed, and I would just preface this with the fact, obviously it's influenced by, like, I serve on these committees, and so I come into the city charter is mentioned a lot, or just things that have kind of served as barriers, I think, to us as committees and as alders kind of doing what we would like to do. So the first thing I have on here is I call it financial checks and balances, and I think this is what you all were discussing before with the comptroller. I'm really not sure 100% like what the issue is, and I don't like want to place blame on any one office, but I would definitely say that the process that we have for contracts and vendors, and even measuring who does what I would like to see, honestly, is just like a clearer definition in our city charter, so that when things are missed, accountability is clear. I think it could be hard to even identify like which office or which person or which role was whose responsibility is this. And so I think a lot of times that leads to like city leaders, no disrespect to any of the CNA members, the mayor's office or comptroller, President Green, but like it can look to others or other citywide offices that we're just pointing at each other saying, oh, well, it was the comptroller. Oh, well, it was the mayor. Oh, well, it was the collector of revenue. It was, and I think that the city charter needs to make it clear who's responsible for financial stewardship, and who, just making that clearer so that we can have easier accountability, and also maybe benefiting from making it non-political. Similar to you all were discussing like what other cities do. I know Megan was saying like the public advocate position is elected. I think right now the person we have that maybe serves closest, and not necessarily a public advocate, but the person who can be least non-political about the budget would be the budget director, which is Paul Payne, but that's still weird because he's still kind of, he will tell you I have 3 bosses. So I just think whatever we can do to get clearer on accountability and on like specifically financial stewardship, and maybe it would be a benefit to making that like non-political, like someone's job is just to get this done. I think at other places they call them city managers. I'm not saying that it has to be a city manager, but maybe just being clear who is responsible for what that role does in other places.
Sure.
Next thing I have is definitely the city councilor's office. I'm sure nobody's surprised. I think like that needs to be made less political or more accountable to all bodies of government, because technically the city councilor is supposed to represent all of us. And to be frank, I don't feel like that's the case. I think that sometimes some of the decisions and interpretations are usually echoing like a different office's political stance. And I've also had some communication where I think things of someone wouldn't say to me if they felt like they were accountable to me. Someone would not communicate with me in this manner, or not communicate, refuse to communicate if they felt like they were truly accountable to the legislative body as a whole. And I think right now, for whatever reason, the city councilor, and I've heard this for other administrations as well, that people perceive it as this position really responds to the executive branch and is really accountable to the executive branch. And I think that needs to be looked at and evaluated. I also have rules for oversight boards. So I think this is really important. I think if you live in the city of St. Louis, I mean, a lot of what I'm mentioning, I'm specifically, I'm thinking of like, we have some issues with the detention facility oversight board and they're ongoing, and there's really no mechanism for, or at least we're having a hard time kind of figure out, is there a mechanism to have an oversight board in the city of St. Louis that is not beholding to any, not like the legislative branch or the executive branch, or if they are, they're equally beholding to all of us, and that can truly practice oversight. I would totally add in my personal opinion of like, I think this is particularly important for our jails and for our police officers and for these entities where, I really want them to be able to be reviewed because they're dealing with life and dealing with security and have guns and things like that and other things where they can truly be viewed accountable, and it doesn't have to be by a political office. And I actually think it's good if it cannot be a political office and it's more community centered. But I think with the city charter right now, it's just not there because all roles for oversight, I think, ultimately lead back to the city councilor's office. And again, if that office really thinks that, you can't have any independent legal counsel, and it can be hard. So I think like that needs to be looked at in connection with the oversight. Like rules for oversight boards is independent legal counsel for these things. The other thing I have is a budget timeline. I was elected on April 18th and our budget was due, is it July, Megan?
July 1st, yeah.
And it's like that's, and I work very hard. I was very diligent. I was in committee meetings every day from 9:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. But I mean, it's just no time. You get elected and you jump right into it. And you have so many departments and so many budgets, and was even able to put together a proposal of like, hey, I think we should fund this and look that. But if you really want your legislators to have time to really do an analysis budget, and also one that we're not right now, it's kind of set up where She&A does it. And then the committee basically just signs off on what's sent, because that's all that there's really time to do. So maybe you get a chair that's really involved in causing the departments, and you get people who take the time outside of committee hearings, but it could be a lot because you still have your community events. Again, in this case, you had 2 new people out of the 5 of us that were on budget, and we did work hard, but I just don't think it's sufficient. It doesn't give you time to really, as committees, I would have liked to have more chance to talk to departments and bring in different staff members and have more of those conversations and learn more proactively, like, what are your challenges, and get a better idea of what data should I be asking to see and trends. And really, I feel like now I'm in a better place because we're 6 months in, but at that time, it's just not there. So I think that timeline is terrible. You should not have an election April 18th. Even if I'm experienced, I might have just come from campaigning. I think it should be where that April 18th timeline and that July 1st timeline is just too close. And that should change. And then my last point, I think Megan got at it. And I think this should totally be up to the people. But I think another thing that the city charter should look at is maybe having at-large alders. I'm not really sure like what that looks like, but I think, if you watch our board meetings or you hear our conversations, a lot of alders, and I think it's easier now it's 14, you see it less, but a lot of us, you can get wrapped up into like, well, that's not an issue in my community, so I don't really think that's relevant, right? Like, but that's because you're only thinking of like your ward, but yet when you pass a policy or you make a budget decision, that's impacting the entire city. And of course, some leaders are like just naturally more, I feel like I'm very holistic, but I also think it's because I come from the board of education where you represent the entire school district and you represent the entire city. So you got in a citywide perspective. And I think like President Green said earlier, obviously right now, President Green is the only one on the legislative board that is supposed to be taking that citywide approach and citywide look. And I think it even makes conversations difficult. Like when we're talking about ward capital, should that be equitable or should it be per community? If we're all elected to represent our wards, it's always going to be a hard conversation. And I don't know that people in those seats will ever feel comfortable, even if they agree personally that, yeah, I should be able to give up some capital for this area of my community to that area of that community because of those ward boundaries. It's like, it's a bad look as an alder if I'm ever not advocating for my community to get as much funding as possible, even when I do agree with the equitable and equity lens. And I think we know, some areas in the city have been disinvested, and demographics are constantly changing. Population numbers are constantly changing. The issues are changing, but you're not necessarily encouraged by the process or the position right now to have a citywide perspective. And that's my quick summary list. I'm sorry, that was a lot.
So on that point, Alderwoman, would you make some number of the 14 at large, or would you add at large members?
I would keep it at 14. I don't think we should add anybody else. And I don't really know like what it looks like. Again, I just know like from my interaction with other places and other elected officials, some of their boards have like half that represent specific people and then half that are at large. And I know that's like another conversation, but I think it can really be sort of a political neutralizer, and it can maybe help St. Louis get out of some of its silos and little cliques and one-sided thinking in some ways.
Okay, very good. On the budget timeline, one of the issues we've talked about in this working group, which is one of the three, has been possibly moving citywide elections to the even year August and November ballots. Had you been elected in November, would that have given you enough time to get your feet on the ground on a budget issue in July?
Yeah, I think so, because I think you really need time even to get experience. Like now I know what regular complaints are from my constituents. Now after 6 months, I have a good idea of like, oh, well, at first they were really complaining about like animals and stray animals. I'm not getting that as much. And then I'll call Dr. Maddie and she'll say, oh, I'm fully staffed. I've staffed all my positions. Thank you so much for but I think you need time to experience the city for a while and experience your community and see the requests and hear from the departments before you can really know like, oh, what is the problem? What's not operating, correctly? So yeah, I think they're really helpful.
I can say one thing about that. So there was a charter amendment to do this probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was pushed by Rex Singfield, and I was against it at the time because I think that there's a step that has to happen before we do that. And I think that step is we need to get the General Assembly to move school board elections to that November ballot as well, because my concern is if we move municipal elections off of April, then the only elections that, because half the school board is on a November, half is on an April ballot. If we do that and we don't address the school board elections that are on that April ballot, then we are putting the school board elections on a very, very, very low turnout election, which makes it a lot easier to buy those school board seats and have a special interest like a Rex Singfield who doesn't believe in public education to get his, slate of folks elected to that and kind of undermine the educational system. So I think I am in support of doing that, and we need to address the school board issue.
Yeah, I'll say too, my original thinking was not to change the timeline for elections, but more so thinking of, could we change the timelines for our budget process as a city? But I don't know if there's like rules or limitations around that, but I would think that would be easier than changing the whole election process.
I think you don't you follow the state year, and so it's July 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You'd have lots of bond covenants and bond folks going wild on that one, I think. But but hey, all right. So, hey, Megan, do you think it's possible to get the General Assembly to move it to November?
Maybe. I don't know that there's ever been a real conversation with any of our city delegation about doing this. And so I think it's worth having a conversation with, Carla May and some of our state reps to see if this is something they would be willing to push.
I have 2 more points that I didn't make, but I bet y'all know that, they're pretty common sense. I really don't like being called an alderman. I like, maybe if it was just alder, sometimes people will say alderwoman, but I think, I would like man to not be the default. Maybe for the sake of equality, we should call them all alderwomen and let that be the default for some time, or we could just take off alder as well. And then my other thing that I would raise is I think there should be a conversation. I don't know who the best people to have a conversation is, but about as far as your legislative body and your alders, right now it's always been I think it was up to us to have this conversation. Like, should you do this in another full-time job? Or, you know, like what that is. And I know that's weird because I know alders have, I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with like, some people do real estate, some people do smaller things that are more like part-time, but I just wonder like who should be looking at, you know, for your legislative body, what is the expectation to be for whether it is full-time, like whether or not you have other full-time employment or not. And I think that as long as it's in our hands, that's like a political conversation, it becomes about other things. But those were the only two things I had that I didn't name.
Just, I want to point out one thing. I definitely agree with the city council or council member or alder, whatever. But we did just update the charter and it's all, technically it's alder person now. Just
Oh.
folks are aware. I think people just aren't in the habit of using it yet. And I think to President Green's earlier point, city council member, it just makes more sense. More people know what it is. Saying alderman, alderwoman, alderperson, or alder, I think is still probably confusing to most everybody outside of St. Louis and even some people here.
Yeah, it is.
Well, and I have to be honest and say that a friend of mine said son is just as bad because it's like person per daughter. You know, I mean, it's you still got the male there. And so you haven't solved that problem.
Yeah. I do want to follow up with something that Alicia said that I also am supportive with the independence of kind of our oversight bodies. You know, when you're looking at like best practices around civilian oversight, you want to see subpoena power, which we have been able to grant them, and you want to see independence. But the way that it's structured right now, we cannot give them true independence because their legal counsel, it still falls back on to the city councilor's office. So again, we end up with this conflict where the city councilor's office is supposed to protect the city from like litigation and risk, but then you have an oversight body that's kind of charged with saying these things are not happening correctly or these are problems, but they're not always able to get the information that they want because they'll issue a subpoena, like the oversight board will issue a subpoena, but it's up to the city councilor's office who has an interest in not, you know, having that information public. It's up to the city councilor's office to give that information to those bodies. And so there needs to be some kind of structure again that allows for that independence so that they can actually tell the city what we're doing wrong. They actually have investigative powers and authority, without the city being like, we're afraid of being sued, so we're just not going to give you the information that you need to make good decisions.
I completely agree.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I think it should not, I think right now we're talking about COB, Civilians Oversight Board, and Detention Facilities Oversight Board. But I think it should be mindful that you never know who, it may be that we need to do that for the Department of Public Health. You never know when we might need to stand up an independent board for oversight for any area of the city. And if we can figure this out proactively before it is an area in other areas, then I think like that is could be to our benefit.
And maybe it is something where like the public advocate is also kind of over these oversight boards, right? And there is that like wall between the, you know, the executive and legislative branches of government, and then this kind of auditing oversight entity that maybe has its own legal department, to be able to, you know, provide that legal staffing independent from the city councilor's office for those oversight boards.
Well, and that's a really, I think, helpful distinction there, because you don't want to say like, let's just hire a lot more lawyers, but to have an independent body that is independent everywhere.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued at this idea of an office of public advocate because there appear to be these conflicts in many different aspects of what we're talking about. And then we could have more clarity between the legislative branch and the executive branch and what their responsibilities are with this Office of Public Advocate, for lack of a better way to call it right now, that really would be charged with community and legal and even fiscal kinds of issues at that point that might be important to maintain the integrity of government with the common citizenry.
All right, well, 2:30, just so everyone knows, not that we have to get off. I just wanted to make sure folks were paying attention to time.
Yeah, Anthony, you were trying to say
Yeah,
something?
can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Hey,
Okay.
yes.
I have two questions and they may be quick, so hopefully I don't take us far over time. One, we have moved from 28 alders to 14. With our current structure, is there any general support you need now? It's not around restructuring the entire branch of government. Any support that's needed now, the past was not thought through in the original transition that you know you need now to better serve.
I mean, I think the biggest things that all alders would unanimously like is the city councilor conversation. I think that's really important because you know, when we're making policy and making decisions, we're beholden to sometimes an interpretation that's influenced by other offices, and it kind of takes away from our ability to have the most productive, you know, political discussions, because we have to use that as basis. And there's been some barriers about like, can we even share, you know, certain legal advice and legal opinion for each other? And it just really makes to have productive conversation. Sometimes the legality can serve kind of as a difficulty. We do have someone on our side that we use a lot, and like that person is super helpful, but I think just structurally that should be evaluated, because that's a problem and a conflict in government. And then, like I said, I think the oversight boards, I think that's something that every alder would agree with, that we want to have the ability when necessary to call in an independent, you know, process when we identify problems limited into our scope of what we can do. And then, yeah, I think the budget process and also like figuring out that every city leader and probably every city resident is going to say something's going on with our contracts and vendors and financial stewardship piece. And I think it could be really simple to just blame like whoever is currently in an office. I think this commission should be looking at like what is in our charter and what is in our systems and policies that is allowing, you know, that it may be also an influencing factor in those challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, you know, number one is the legal support. I mean, the workload has, I would say, gone up significantly for older people in the reduction, both in terms of like the quality and type of like legislation that's being done and the amount of, you know, constituent service kind of issues that arouse. But I think going back to something Alicia said earlier too is, you know, that full-time status, because, you know, I do notice as president, like the older people that are doing this full-time are producing a lot more work, right? Than the ones who also have full-time employment that kind of come to the board meetings, but then they don't really engage in committees and you know, aren't working on a lot of legislation and stuff. And so like, I wouldn't want to do something that prohibits people from having any outside employment. You know, in terms of transparency, I teach 2 classes, one at WashU, one at SLU. And I think like being able to teach a class on how government works and have your professor be somebody who actually works in government is like beneficial. But that's 6 hours a week, right? For like half the year. It's not something that's taking my, you know, time away from being president of the board in any like meaningful way. And so I think there's a difference between like that kind of work versus somebody who's, you know, working a regular 40-hour a week job in addition to being older person.
Yeah, I would say I think that really is the key language, is to say like no other full-time employer, because I even think like it can easily be a conflict because you have 2 full-time bosses. And I think that if you run for this position and you're doing this, the people need to be your full-time employer. And like if you can do other things part-time capacity, but full-time not. And it could be hard too at a time like this where you know, we have so like a charter commission, we have RAM settlement, we have ARPA, we're having so many systematic conversations about liquor license and Airbnb. Like we really are trying to take a look at systems, but people have to have time to handle the micro work of their ward. Like I have to be able to manage my communications with my constituents and deal with their alleys and deal with their stray animals and write their letters of support for their organizations and make sure that businesses are able to navigate city processes and meet with my business and see what city processes are, you know, barriers to you, and support my community improvement districts and manage any appointments that anybody in my ward has to any boards. And am I meeting with those folks and talking to those folks? And I could go on, right? And that's all micro level work. But then you really do have a serious legislative macro work where you need time to read through policy, look at data, conduct research, meet with city departments, meet with the president's office, meet with the mayor's office, pull in financial analysts, get your legal analysis from inside counsel and outside counsel. It really is something that is a full-time capacity. If you're doing this to me in the way that the city deserves, it's going to be more than 40 hours a week. You really don't have time for another full-time 40-hour position. And if you do, you're just not going to be able to do the quality. I don't think this job is like easily manageable at all, but certainly it's not manageable for you to deliver at the micro and macro level that you have to, and have another full-time commitment for anything. It's just not, on top of like people already have full-time commitments with a personal life of like being a daughter or a sister or a partner or a parent or, you know, whatever all of that is. So I would really echo that because I think that would be something that will hold the city back and could lead to us kind of blowing the ball if those types of expectations are not clear and we don't have, regardless of personal views, if we should all agree that this is our dedication and this is our commitment.
Yeah, I thought of one other thing, kind of overall thing that I think has come up over the years as well. And that's the ability to level fines and fees. The charter, you know, it's capped at $500 right now. We've taken a few things over the years directly to the ballot to, you know, raise the amount that we can do a fine for. But something we put together at, you know, or we have a group working on at the board right now is kind of, it's around strategic code enforcement. And so like one of the things we've talked about is like, we know that we have a number of like bad actors with vacant property in the city, right? And it would be better to be able to have a system where like the more vacancy you have, the higher the fines you get or something like that, you know? So these companies that are holding on to hundreds of properties are not just being charged like $500 every 6 months for that, but there's some kind of ability to have an escalating fee scale against it. So it's like trying to find that balance, because we don't want fines to be leveled in ways that are inequitable or, you know, are targeting people who are, you know, poor, and our hands are often tied when it comes to like those perpetual bad actors, those bigger businesses, bigger developers that own a lot of property, always have illegal dumping issues, always have a lot of vacant property, but we're limited by the types of fines that we can assess on them. And so it's cheaper to just pay the fine than it is to actually ever fix the problem.
Mhm. Okay, great.
And if I may really quickly, we hear a lot about historic disinvestment. My question is, where are the current areas of inequity on the board so that we don't perpetuate that historic disinvestment based upon current inequity? So I'm assuming there is some, I don't know, but I'm asking, where is the current equity within the board structure?
I mean, I think that one of the biggest problems, and this is not charter, this is ordinance, but when we passed the capital tax to create ward capital, we said that it would be distributed equally. But we know that the north side in particular, because it is less populated, it means that there are bigger districts, which means that they have more roads that need paved, more lights that need replaced, more dumpsters that need to be replaced, more sidewalks that need to be replaced, simply because they cover more surface area, but they're getting the same amount of money that wards that are more densely populated and more condensed get. And so it really perpetuates the disinvestment when you already have disinvested areas, but then you're asking to have to address more of those capital needs over a larger area with the same amount of money that everybody else gets. And we tried to update that via ordinance last year. It did not pass for, some of the reason that I think Alicia said earlier. Nobody wants to take that vote that's saying, well, I'm giving more money to this area of the city because it's then taking, some money away from my community. And that's one of the things that I would hope that some at-large seats could help fix is you have people who are thinking more globally about these policies and not just kind of protecting their little piece of the pie.
What was the vote total for and against that ordinance?
I think it ended up failing by 3 or 4 votes.
And I would point out too that ironically, some of the votes against that, this is a factual point, were from alders that would have benefited from that change. And this is the danger in this being a political decision, is that political decisions are not always made at what is actually in the best interest of people. There's a number of other individual factors, whether it is a personal dislike for who's proposing a policy, or I just don't have like necessarily the political courage to face my community and say, hey, you know what? Y'all actually are very well off and very well invested and growing rapidly. And this part of the city is really struggling. But like either way, like it's hard across the board. And I think that's like, if you guys could do something to address that. And I would say we have a responsibility to, because whether we explain it the way Megan explained it, or whether we go back to the historic reasons of why that is the case, that those areas have, are not as populated, and we know that wasn't by mistake, that was by intentional choice. We have to do something and set up systems and processes to favor that type of decision making. And if we can get on the front end by just as a city saying we have a responsibility to, make decisions based off of actual geographical data, then I think like that can just neutralize some of those political other factors that can get into the conversation.
All right.
Thank you both.
Great. Thank you, guys. It was really helpful.
Yeah, this was really useful. I appreciate it.
I would just say too, your equity question, I do think it also does linger in making sure that there's a balanced power and balanced checks and balances and balanced abilities to make decisions, just in terms of our political structure. I think that's where that city councilor and the financial stewardship piece really kick in, because we don't have the ability to have some of the conversations we should be able to have as political leaders, because it's just kind of an understanding of like, well, at the end of the day, this is up to me and it's not going to change. And so it just kind of always leaves it up to just one person or one office, which really leads back to one person usually. And rather than it being a case where we all have to kind of be in communication and actually have collaborative governance. I guess that's what I'm saying, that a part of equitable in our political offices means that like we need systems and processes that for St. Louis almost forces us to have collaborative governance and forces us to be in conversations and forces us to have checks and balances with each other.
Yeah. And could I say one last thing before we wrap up too, that I was thinking about just in terms of like budgeting? Something that I think would be great to, if we're reworking the budgeting process, is to have some kind of participatory budgeting requirement.
Please.
Because again, I think that's something that we continue to lack the political will to do. But overall, I think requiring that for, as a piece of our budgeting process would build back more trust in government, create more transparency around how we make these decisions, give people, an ability to have a direct say, while also recognizing that we still, like, participatory budgeting in and of itself does not solve all of the issues around inequity. If only the people who are the most engaged and well informed are the folks who, you know, show up to vote and weigh in. Like there has to be really intentional work done to engage constituencies, whether they be, you know, immigrants or folks that are not yet able to vote, or areas of the city that are more poor or whatever. There has to be some, I think, investment in those processes to make sure that we're actually hearing from a representative group of the city, and not just like the folks that have the privilege to show up at a neighborhood meeting. But I think having some kind of participatory budgeting process that is ingrained in our budget process could be very powerful
I
as
know
a
we have
city.
to go. I'm copying Megan and saying one last thing, but totally tied to what she just said. I think also a lot of alders are actually in favor of getting rid of ward capital. I think if you're talking about inequities, the fact that it is, and I'm saying, I would say this even for me and even for the 7th Ward, and I tried to have my own kind of participatory budgeting process, and I've been taking input as much as I can from like my community at meetings and stuff. But at the end of the day, it should not be up to one person to decide what streets get picked and what potholes get filled and who gets new trash cans and where the speed humps go and what traffic lights should be here and where a stop sign should go. And we need an intersection here, because even with the best of efforts, and that's why I'm using myself as an example, to distribute evenly, and I try to give every neighborhood the same amount and, you know, put in some equity factors. As long as it's up to me as a political official to do this and not up to a streets department or an organization that's actually an urban planner and actually has the skills to make the best decisions for the city holistically, we're going to lead to problems. Whether it's that I could decide that I want to save up for a project that cost me $400,000. So while other communities are starting to get improvements, I'm saving up my money, could be for a worthwhile project. But the fact that this is the main funding stream for capital and infrastructure improvements to the ward, and it's up to just me, it's like problematic across the board. And I think you could put this on any alder. And I've actually heard at least 7 of my colleagues say, oh, I would be in favor of, you know, but I would say you have to tie that. We would be in favor of it, but only if we can see that there's efficiency with some of those contracts and vendor processes. Because to ask me to let go of something, but my constituents come to me and they expect me to do this and I can't now, but we don't have an efficient process, doesn't work. And 3, it has to have an equity conversation with that component too, so that then it's okay to really identify and focus on areas that have had, you know, those historic disinvestments across the city.
And I apologize. This was great. Thank you both. I have got to go. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Thank
all
you.
of you. Yeah.
We
thank you.
appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.